It's back up again now. We just took a small 5-minute break. It's been up there most of the time. We periscoped your discussion. You had about 10 people watching at some points. You've had about
It's really the camera.
is it?
Yeah. I put it to default, like saying symbols, and it's startup video. Sometimes it's almost irrational.
So lunch today will be cake.
Apparently so.
So, we're just about to get started again. The next member of the committee is the Associate Professor, Anna Longbourn.
Thank you for a dissertation about materials. As you know, it lies very close to my heart. And I think that's also a little bit where I want to start my line of questioning.
Right.
You you said here in the presentation that you hadn't done this ontological approach to materials, and that's kind of obvious, to be honest. So just let me give you some examples, and then I want your reaction to it.
Yeah.
So on page 2, materials are equal technologies. Later on, they become pragmatic technologies, but to start with, they're just technologies. Later again, on page 20, you borrow Weber's notion of that we don't talk about materials anymore, we only talk about the materiality, we only talk about the experiences of materials.
Mm-hmm.
Later on again, they become the external representations, the sketches and the prototypes. And then they're also the stuff from which you craft an artifact.
Mm-hmm.
And today, they're external representations. Right? So, if you were to talk about what role materials play in the design process,
Mm-hmm.
what is it that has a role in the design process?
Okay, yes. I'll start with some ground clearing. So, I don't think I on my slides said external representations. I said external resources.
Oh, sorry.
Yes,
External resources. Yeah, I couldn't read my.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Okay, just so because yeah. All right. Yes. And second, so those a couple of those examples you gave there from my background section.
From your introduction.
From my introduction, yes, and then we move into the background session. For instance, the place where I cite Michael on page 20. So what I wanted to do with that section was to give an overview of. So I had the problem that I had chosen to use the word material to denote these, as I call them, external resources that we draw upon in design processes. I've chosen to use that word for a specific reason. We can get back to it in a moment. But I felt the need. I had the need to relate to other people who use the same word. So, for instance, and now you can tell me if I'm wrong, but in your paper, together with Johan West on computational composites, materials is clearly something physical, right? That is then transformed through computation, of course. But if we go to, for instance, Bourdieu's and yes, data. Sorry, I can't remember the last name. It's very hard name. Masmaninov, I think. Yes, there we go. Bourdieu and Masmaninov. They talk about data as a material. And when Turing talks about design as a conversation with the material of the situation, I mean, we are sort of on shaky ground here with the word, aren't we? Because they're not exactly. Now, data is, of course, has a physical manifestation, but when Bourdieu and Masmaninov talks about data being something, being a material, they're talking about it in an almost metaphorical sense. Just like when we talk about coding as crafting, for instance, you're not talking about it in a sort of classic sense of the word you're talking about as a useful metaphor. So that was the problem I had, that I had chosen to use the word material, and it is used in a wide range of ways in the field. So maybe one answer could be that maybe I shouldn't have used that word. Another answer could be that by using the word materials, I want to draw attention to the fact that we are drawing them in and transforming these external resources. They're transformed throughout the design process. They're shaped, reshaped as part of this being in the world that I talked about when I described my pragmatic standpoint. So that was the reason for calling it materials.
Can I just stay here a little bit?
Yes.
Because yes, obviously, there are lots of different use. I mean, authors use materials about the text they're writing.
Yes, yes.
So definitely, the word material, the concept material, is used in a variety of different ways. But the key is, as researcher, to be clear about how do you use it. What does it entail for you in the context that you're using it in?
Yeah.
And so, is it technologies for you? Is it in your dissertation you write external representations and not resources?
Yeah.
The resources came on today.
Yes.
Or is it the stuff we make it from, or are you sort of encompassing everything in the concept of being a material?
Okay.
or
So
materials?
this is actually, so when I call it technology, I refer to it in the pragmatist sense of the word. Which
Not yet at this point.
no,
Nope.
you might be right. I'm sure you're right. But
If you're further down the line,
Yeah.
you refer to it as pragmatic.
Yes. Because on page 2 at the end, I say, shaped by the work of pragmatic philosopher John Dewey, which I developed into focus on understanding design materials as technology.
Okay, sorry. Yes,
Yes,
actually, this concept of technology, which is not yet defined. So
That's correct.
Right. But what does but instead of saying looking at this,
Mhm.
what is it? Are you talking about everything? Because in this context, everything can be talked about as a material.
Yeah.
The fact that we interact is a material. Everything is a material, right?
Yes.
From this point of view.
Yes. Let's say.
So what are we not talking about?
Okay. Yes.
Is there a sort of a border where your research doesn't reach?
Yeah. So that definitely. So that's this is sort of tricky, and it confuses me. It confused me for the longest time as well, and maybe it still does a little. It's clearly some of my writing reflects. So in a pragmatist sense, anything is a technology if it's drawn into inquiry in order to, as I said, transform the situation into a situation that's more desirable and so forth, right? So clearly in that sense, anything can be a technology, a theory, a piece of wood, your language, etc., etc. But the kinds of materials I've been looking at is, in my own perspective at least, the things that we would typically talk about when we talk about design processes, sketches, prototypes, code, wood, etc., etc. And that's evidently not clearly defined what my demarcation there is, because in a pragmatist sense, that's not a useful demarcation. I completely agree with you there. That's not a useful demarcation of what it is.
In any sense, it's not useful.
At least not in the sense of demarcating what is, but it also reflects, you said it yourself actually in the beginning, it also reflects my pragmatist standpoint to a very, perhaps a little too extreme degree, in that I would say that any conceptualization of a phenomena, in this case, now we're discussing the conceptualization of what material means, right, reflects a specific research interest. So in my case, I'm interested in how we draw external resources, things outside of our mind, basically, into design processes, transform them, and progress through a design problem that way. So that's the reason for choosing that specific conceptualization. Now, we might choose another one, but that's, I remember we once had a...
So if it's all kinds of external resources that you're addressing here, that goes into a design process, how can you say, what is it that you can say about the role that they play?
Physical and digital. I can...
No, that's, now you're, I mean, that's, now you're trying to specify it as something that's not necessarily an experience or sort of...
Yeah, that is the problem I have here, exactly, as you correctly point out, that in a pragmatist sense of technology, it might be an experience. I mean, you draw on something in your repertoire that might be a pen, or it might be an experience or theory or something like that, right? But the things I'm interested in, research-wise, is the things that I've been investigating in these papers. So clearly the demarcation between what I look at here and what material might be from pragmatist perspective is not as clear as it could be. I completely agree with that.
Okay, so let's say what you've been looking at in your papers.
Okay, yes.
You mentioned post-its, the blueprint from the first paper, and some paper dolls that we saw in the video. You also talk about in crafting code at the demo scene, right? It becomes programming that is the materials. And from my point of view, there's a huge difference between the conceptual designs, the design thinking approach, and the craft approach that you report in that paper. And so you mentioned, I think it's on page 37, you talk about this symmetrical understanding that you have to have between this kind of materials that is at play in both situations. And what does that mean? what is a symmetrical understanding between post-its and code in this context?
See, I just find my own quote. I have a chance to quote myself. See, page 47 is it?
Yeah, I have argued for symmetrical understanding of materials used for design thinking and for shaping products.
Yeah.
And what does that mean?
Okay, yes. That means that I see the value, of course, in clearly I see the value in what the material move is doing. But I do consider that way of talking about material, I do consider that a methodological distinction rather than an ontological one, because when we talk about design processes, we as designers would not make a distinction between now I'm sketching. It makes no difference for inquiry whether you're sketching or whether you are transforming a piece of code or a piece of clay. I would argue, at least. That's what pragmatism offers. It offers a comprehensive way of looking at what role different kinds of material
I beg
processes.
to differ. There is a huge difference whether you without any real constraints draw some picture on a paper, a pretty picture on a paper, and being able to actually realize that through construction. Those are two completely different processes.
I don't know. Okay, yes.
So I'm kind of curious. Where is the symmetry between? I mean, the crafting bit of it is a different thing that the idealized picture I can draw on a post-it or a bigger sort of piece of paper.
Okay, but then let me try to find an example that is sort of middle of the road, and because now we had sort of two extremes, drawing a pretty piece of pretty picture on a piece of paper. That's hard to say. and crafting technique. So with my, for instance, when I the last time I did some programming, I was sort of fiddling around with some stuff on an Arduino, which was not meant to be the final product. It was meant to be a prototype. So one distinction we could draw is say, okay, is this a prototype or is this the final product? Because crafting would then be, in my opinion at least, now you can disagree with me of course if you want to, but crafting would be me taking the material that the final product is meant to be made of and shaping it, reshaping and letting that inform my thinking, basically, this conversation with the materials written and so forth. And for instance, discussed. So, but in the case that I'm mentioning here, it's actually a little unclear whether I'm crafting the final product or whether I'm fiddling around with the Arduino to see what it can do.
But before I start building sculptures in clay, I do a lot of experimentation first.
Yes,
so I become familiar with the material.
Yes.
And that is perhaps more keen to what you were doing with the Arduino than sketching before I know anything about the material. Sketching these abstract sort of pictures on paper.
Yep. I agree, of course, that it's two different things, and how can it not be? But I would say that for the process of working through a problem, I mean, that's some of the value of the stuff that's been, that for instance, you have been doing, is that you show what can be gained from starting with the material. For instance, your big last paper with the name shows the value of starting from the material, starting with the craft material, and maybe not departing far from it. And you could say, perhaps with the exception of the crafting code paper, I would say that most of these things they start from a concept. Can you distinguish between conceptual and materials? I'm not sure I buy that distinction, but I'll do it. Let's try it.
Okay.
I would call that starting from two different places in the design space, in my opinion. And of course, it makes a great difference to the output. But I would still claim that my pragmatist perspective offers a way of looking at both. And then those in-betweens that I discussed before, what do we do with them? And maybe you didn't agree it was an in-between, for example. But I would say that when you're working through a design problem, you don't necessarily yourself make that distinction between now and crafting. Of course, those that have that as an explicit research interest do, but if...
No, but that doesn't mean that they play the same role.
No.
Right? And in your work, you talk about them as if they play the same role. And I'm not yet, you might convince me, but I'm not yet convinced.
Okay. Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So in order for you to make the argument that you can talk about all materials and you can talk about the role they play in the design process, you need to sort of show me how they stuff that in my mind is very distinct.
Yes. Oh, but I would never say that they play the same role. But I wouldn't say.
But what role they play? You talk about what role materials play
Yes.
in the design process.
Yeah, yes, indeed. And my answer is not this role. My answer is materials play different roles dependent on their qualities, and that role in specific design processes might be understood by looking at through the lens of pragmatism. That's the pragmatism is the offer for understanding.
So being slightly provocative here, didn't we know that already? That material plays different roles in design processes.
Yes.
So
we did already know that.
what is your contribution?
My contribution, hopefully, is a conceptual framework for then talking about this specific instance. Which role might that play in this specific case that I was talking to you here about before? And it's a way of being articulate and offering ways of reflecting. Perhaps before we start with the design thinking workshop example here before, which was slightly strong-managed, it's a way of being articulated about what actually goes on in design processes. Of course, we know that materials play a role. Otherwise I would use them. but what I offer here is not a different exhaustive account of what materials do. And
so it's not a better understanding of what role materials play, but it is a tool for researchers to post fact describe what role they played in their particular case.
I would say, I'm not going to go that far. I would rather say, I see what you're saying, but I would rather say that by offering a way for them to describe that, what role they played in their research cases, we built this theoretical grounding that I talked about in my introduction. By building up this theoretical grounding, we sort of build the stepping stones for people to be more articulate about what materials do. For instance, the discussion we just had about which role does it play that we start in different places of the design space, which makes a huge difference, as you said. Is that right? And a lot of the stuff we do is perhaps conceptual design or concept-driven design, dependent on which kind of flavor you want. Yeah. So the offer is the theory for understanding what already goes on in design practice, but it's also a theoretical grounding for perhaps advancing that design practice by becoming more articulate about the design processes and what raw materials play.
And those are all very noble sort of intentions, but you need to show me some examples of it.
Yeah. So we have a couple here. I have some more rejected ones, but I didn't do it for modesty. So we could take the crafting code example. That's not a very good one because it doesn't have an explicit account of the Dewey theory. But let's take it anyway, because what I was arguing there was that I wanted to highlight the back and forth between the material and the programmer also goes on in a coding practice. That might be considered almost an embodied practice, I think. Someone's not binding when she was editing the paper last. And I wouldn't disagree with that, of course. It's a English word. So that's one example.
But that's an example of the back and forth between material and design. And that's where Sherman was already, right? So McCullough from years ago said this about crafting code and so on. So we sort of been there. I mean, I like that paper, so don't get me wrong. But what is it that you bring to the table in terms of understanding what went on?
I think what I bring to the table is a more detailed account, perhaps. It's everybody knows that you have a conversation with the material, but how do we analyze that conversation with the material? That is the very.
How do we analyze it?
We do analyze it. You asked me. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So, one way of analyzing it would be, as I've done here, to go out into practice either as a participant or, in the case of the crafting coding one, I'm an observer of another person's practice, and then using the theoretical framework to articulate what goes on.
Please do it. Please use the theoretical framework to explain what went on in that case.
Okay, sure. Let's see now if I can remember the case. So interesting. Can I give some background? That's on the paper. Okay, sure. What goes on in that case is that someone is creating a piece of digital art that runs in code on a really old computer. It's an Amiga, it has 66 megahertz. That's not too important, it's just important to know that it's a very constrained platform. So we have a digital platform here that's quite constrained. So that's the first thing. So the coder here in this, he arrives at a problematic situation where he has a desire to resolve it. He has a desire to end up at some point where he has a cool demo, but he doesn't, as we call these things, he doesn't know exactly where he's going to end up. He ends up there by starting in the problematic situation, examining the possibilities he has, and then working through it. He tries out different transformations, and that was the point of the paper. It shows how his technical setup, basically using a piece of open source software called New Rocket, that allows him to basically try out different iterations of this piece of digital art using his MacBook to remote control the Amiga. That's a bit of an imprecise description. But anyway, so by having that specific tool set up, that workshop, if you will, to talk about it in Craftsman terms, it's possible for him to work through a lot of iterations, to work through a lot of different transformations. He tries out different transformations. I have the description in the dissertation of this induction, deduction loop that Julie talks about, that you have a theory about what could be good solutions to this problem. So for instance, he'll say, maybe if I timed it to the, in these things you typically time the music, you time the visuals to the beat. So maybe if I timed this blinking visual, if I timed that to the snare instead of to the drum or something like that, then he tries to do that. Because his setup allows him to do that in a really, really easy way, then he's able to go through a lot of transformation. And I had that on one of my slides as well, this thing that the materials give direction and shape to the inquiry. So we can see, and maybe I should have put that in the paper, but I was sort of, I don't like we can see arguments, but we can see, I'll do it here, that this setup that he now has here is a relatively new setup. 10 years ago they were coding in assembly on these, maybe 15, I'm getting old, they were coding in assembly language on these old Amigas. So this setup he has here gives a specific shape and direction to his inquiry that means that these things they are now able to create. They could do it technically before. I mean, he can't transcend the limitations of the machine. He can't transcend the limitations of the material. Of course he can, but he can transcend them creatively. He can sort of work with them in new ways. He can work through more possibilities, basically. So there's nothing he can do technically now with this setup that he couldn't do before. He can just do it in a lot easier ways.
Because he has new tools.
Because he has new tools, yes. Or new ways of thinking about it. I'm not sure. It's sort of a...
But new ways of thinking doesn't appear on its own.
No,
That's kind of the point.
It's definitely intimate.
Like it's a relationship between new technical possibilities for ways to play around with this platform.
Definitely.
So okay. So I need you to go into discussing sort of or explaining for me
That was very mean French there. Sorry, you need me to explain.
Yeah, no, drink water. So this pragmatism,
Yes.
it starts with a problem.
In a very wide sense of the word problem, it might start with an indeterminate situation doing things in other places, but I'm sure you call it problems. Yes.
You start with a problem.
Yes.
You go into transformation
Yes.
so that you again become part of the rhythm of the society.
Yes.
Is that covering all design processes? Can you imagine a design process where that's not the progression?
I'm gonna say no, but in a very wide sense of no, because you might imagine design process where you simply give up, where you decide that this, okay, I wanted to create this product, but there's no way of creating it, or you get angry, or you run out of money for some reason in one way. And I'm not sure it's a design process. And it might also be that you start out and find out it's impossible what you want to do, and then you. But I'm going to say that I can't imagine one. I'll
So what if I design something that does not go back or sort of restore a rhythm, but is on the contrary very disruptive.
Yeah.
Right? A lot of new technologies that are
Yeah.
sent into the market disrupt current infrastructures quite a bit.
Yeah.
How do you explain those from a pragmatic point of view, from this progression?
I think by this work, I think your local, if your design process is design, maybe, I don't know if you intend to design something disruptive, but let's say you do, it doesn't matter for the argument.
It's very hot these days to design disruptive technology.
Yes.
Yeah.
I imagine people will stop calling me about design thinking at one point and start calling me about disruption instead. Anyway, nobody calls me. Listen, all right. So your design process, I would argue that you have a question you want to explore. You have this problem you want to explore.
Do I know?
I don't know why are you doing the disruptive design?
Maybe I'm messing around with technologies,
Yeah.
and through that.
But then that's the start. That's the starting point. That might be the starting point. In my perspective, that might be the starting point. My aim of this is to mess around with technology. That might be your purpose. And then, of course, as inquiry evolves, that's the point. Your objective might change. You don't start with an overall objective that never changes. Of course not, because you might not know what's going on. We have the example in the tangible tabletop table, the material interaction with tangible tabletops. Many of the people who come up to that table. This is a good example of many of the people who come up to this tangible tabletop are like, "What's this? I don't know what it is, but I'll now start messing about with it." And then they find out, oh, okay, it can make music. And then their objective changes into, so objectives in a pragmatic sense, it changes into, now I've made a little performance, or, oh, it's just a piece of music instrument, I'll go away. Either way, the inquiry has ended, the experience is over, if you will. Maybe
But that's not disruptive, right?
no, that's very undisruptive. You could at least
That's
try.
about creating harmonies through music.
Yeah, but
So,
it's,
but coming back to designing disruptive technology,
Yeah.
regardless of the outset,
yeah.
is that encompassed by this pragmatic trajectory of design process?
It's not something I've looked at, so, but maybe I should, going back to Nick has questions about the axis, but I'll go to one of my own slides here. So, I painted this flow of existence, this rhythm that you can be exchanged with, right? And I also have a quote on the next slide about the march of the surrounding things. So, in my opinion, your inquiry would go something like this. I'm messing about with whatever you're messing about with in your life. I know you mess about with many exciting things in your life. And you end up at one point saying, oh, well, this is sort of cool, I'll let it loose on the world. And maybe that's where your inquiry ends, or maybe it goes on for longer. That's sort of a question of levels of analysis. The point being that what you do in your flow of existence will affect other people. So that's where the disruption comes in. You do something that affects other people, because you're always in exchange with your environment. And right now, I'm in your immediate environment. So we are sort of maybe disrupting each other's environment unless a drawn external result is true. Exactly, yeah. So maybe right now you're disrupting some of my existence. In a good way.
Yeah, but it comes back to the same point as with the materials.
Okay, yes.
Is there a limitation to what this pragmatic idea or notion of a design process, sort of its explanatory power, is there a limitation to that? Or does it encompass everything?
Yeah. There's lots of limitations to it, I would say, but not necessarily the one you just mentioned with disruption. Because I would claim that that's what covered by the ones of the surrounding things that we affect each other. That's what we do in a creative workshop, for instance. I would say, well, did you know that we now can have actuators that bend wood, for instance? I will say that, and then someone will say, oh, I didn't know that. Then maybe we could use that to create a computer. In that case, I disrupted that person's.
Yeah, but that's a very sort of that's a very key, participatory design kind of way of.
Yes.
Right? That's the things that you're talking about.
Okay, good.
Right?
Yes.
But are there? You talk about this as a view to understand design processes in general.
Yeah.
Is there a limitation where this is not a good way of talking about the design process?
Yeah.
Or let me ask in a different way. What do we actually learn? What does this theory lend us in terms of understanding of design process?
Yes, and what doesn't it, maybe?
Yeah, but start with explaining to me
yes,
what do I know now about design processes that I didn't know before?
Small caveat, as I said to Michael, maybe with this, I mean, we all know, everybody who's practicing design and good at it probably knows that there's always an exchange with the materials, but maybe they all don't always know why. But let's keep that. I'll just keep that on storage for a moment. So what we gain from it is a way of being articulated about the interplay of reflection and changes in the external environment, if you will, or manipulations of the material, transformations of materials. So what we gain there is a coherent framework for talking about this interplay between addressing design thinking and design materials. So that's what we gain, one coherent framework for talking about.
But still make the argument how that's at all can be combined.
Haven't I?
How no, I asked you about what's the symmetry between crafting and design thinking that I still haven't been convinced about.
But that's because I would consider crafting a sort of inquiry where the primary transformations, the focus of the transformations are on transforming physical materials, whereas in design thinking we're probably talking about transforming our perception of the situation. For instance, if we do an ethnographic field study, right, we will say that our goal is to, I'm choosing two examples in sort of the extreme ends of the spectrum, right? If we do an ethnographic field study, we say, well, the focus here is on transforming our understanding of practices, not so much on transforming this notebook or whatever that you're using for, and in the crafting example, we would say, well, the focus here is on transforming the physical material. But if I have to be faithful to the pragmatist's viewpoint, and then I can cover limitations in a moment, then I would have to say that all transformations are equal. You wouldn't distinguish because you're never outside of your own environment. So transformation inside of your perception, inside of your mind, is not, they are symmetrical, that's what I mean. They're symmetrical to transformations outside of you, basically. So there's no transformation that goes on in here and out here. It's all transformations that you affect in your environment, and your environment do things in return, in response to what you do. So you're always in engagement with your environment, basically. So that's what I mean by symmetrical. I don't mean to, as I said in the beginning, which was meant as a provocative statement, and clearly it was, that I didn't necessarily want to draw ontological distinctions between things. And that's not that I say that things are the same. Rather, I say that they're very particular. So I would say, well, in design we use a lot of different materials, and they're all different in a way. What we get by pragmatism, what we get by using pragmatism, is a way of discussing them that encompasses both their unique situatedness as well as being able to encompass all of them. I'll try that.
So what you're saying is that in a design process, transformation takes place.
Yes, I'm definitely saying that. But
is that your contribution?
No, my contribution is giving a theoretical framework that offers you a very coherent and precise way of talking about it.
Really?
I don't know, the papers don't show.
But the preciseness is what I'm lacking, because you're talking about everything.
Yeah.
Right? So
that's because I refuse to get tied down to saying this material is not the same as this sketch.
So maybe let's move it on a little bit and just tell me about the limitations of the pragmatic sort of.
Yes. There's a boring answer, which is sort of the generic limitations of any sort of theoretical framework you choose. And we all know this, right? That any theoretical standpoint you choose will come with a lot of obligations, a lot of advantages, and of course some disadvantages. That's how it is. And of course pragmatism has some of those too. So one example, for instance, is that, as Michael said, the focus on collaboration is perhaps not as elaborated in pragmatism as it could be. I've tried to do some things here, and one question that you might ask me, I'm asking myself, is so how do we tie together pragmatism and participatory design? And we would probably say that in the publications here, it hasn't been done to the extent that I could wish for. So that's one limitation, perhaps, that focus on collaboration, because it is very much the focus is very much on the individual human agent transforming something outside of his own, well, also inside of his own body, but anyway, yes, the individual human agent transforming something. So that's one limitation. Perhaps the focus on collaboration is not as elaborate as you want to. So if I use, for instance, activity theory, I would have gained some advantages. It's very good for conceptualizing some things, but not others. Let's not go too deeply into that, but the point is being that, of course, different theoretical standpoints will yield different advantages and disadvantages. Another disadvantage, I would say, is that, I said that before, now the Action Network, the STS people left. Maybe that's good.
I want to tie into that, because that paper, where you start using it, right, it gives a fresh perspective on an already existing concept. It lends new insights that are immediate and apparent. I don't see that with a pragmatic sort of theory. It doesn't lend me any new insights. Maybe I can describe everything and anything with this framework, but what new kinds of insight does that practice lend me?
So I'm going to diss my own paper a little bit, because I'm not going to agree that it's a new.
Well, that bit I don't know, because I'm not.
Okay. But it is what it is a more precise description of what we mean by participation in design.
Which was interesting, and there was a point. No, but seriously, there was an immediate. Okay, this is the usual understanding of participation. Let's look at it from this perspective, and now we see some nuances that wasn't apparent before, right?
Yes.
So there is a new kind of insight going on. But where is the corresponding new insights that we get from using this pragmatic perspective?
So I would say that, and that probably hasn't come out probably in the dissertation, otherwise I would be asking. But I would say that what we do, there's sort of a kindship between that paper, what you just said very nicely about that paper, that it gives you a more precise, nuanced insight into a phenomenon that everybody probably knows that participation is important, at least if they're sort of vaguely related to participatory design. My aim with the dissertation, and maybe I failed in some cases, was to do the same thing for how we interact with materials, to give a more nuanced and precise description of how we interact with materials when we use them in design processes. And that was the aim, I would say. So it gives us kind
But if you refuse to say what material is, and you refuse to say that it's anything but transformations, then I'm still not.
I'm not sure I refuse to say what material is. Did I refuse that? I think
it was post-its, and it's thinking, and it's a pretty broad spectrum of aspects that you include in your concept.
But now, okay. So I think now I will say that I do not say that. I say that materials can be viewed through the lens of pragmatic technology. I don't say that if something is pragmatic technology, it is also a material, because then everything that can be used in a transformational, in an inquiry, is a material. And that would be, then I'm just introducing a new word, swapping pragmatic technology for materials. I'm not saying that, but I agree with you that perhaps it is unclear where the range of what I mean by material, what the potential, where would this project, let's say I got 5 years more to do this, where would I end? Now I've explored some materials. I've started probably in sort of the classic design thinking materials, post-its, etc., and then I progressed towards more.
I would never call post-it design materials.
No.
For me, that's a technology you use in a design process.
Yes.
So there are lots of different definitions of what material is and isn't. And you've chosen not to go into that, and that's obviously a conscious choice. But it also lands you in a bit of trouble.
It does.
When you want to convey something about this aspect, right?
Yes, I agree. But what I wanted to gained by using the word material was to draw attention to the fact that we have these materials that we draw into a design process, we shape things out of them, we reshape those things, and then we end up somewhere either with a product or with a concept or something like that. So I mean, that was the point, was to draw attention to the fact that these things are something out there in the world that we can pick up metaphorically if it's code, physically if it's something physical.
Do you really think working with code metaphorically?
No, but I mean, some people would say that code is not.
You kind of had a whole paper arguing the opposite, right?
Yeah, but in that case, I subscribe to a somewhat broad. I mean, code here is something that appears on a screen. It is not on a physical screen. I mean, the code is not.
Yeah, that's how it presents itself to you.
Yeah,
Code is not what appears on the screen. Code is what
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean.
runs the computer in a certain way.
Exactly. So I was just saying that already there, the definition expanded, because you might say that materials, if you take dictionary definition, materials is the matter that we craft things from. It's probably something like that it says in the Oxford Dictionary. I didn't want to put the dictionary definition in the dissertation. I hate when people do that. But that's sort of the layman's definition of materials, probably, right? And then we had varying levels of, I would say that we start with that definition, and then it becomes more and more metaphorical. So for instance, when I say that we have the conversation with the material of the situation, well then in that case it's also very vague what's meant by material. You're talking about it more in a way that, for instance, in a court of law, you would talk about the material that the walls are made out of, some sort of wood, and in a court of law, you could also talk about the material witness, which is the person who's in focus right now, who's doing important.
I don't agree. Material in general is used in a pretty wide sort of many different definitions.
I did not manage to solve that. I had clearly.
But you didn't have to. You just have to choose.
Yeah.
Is kind of my point. If you want to talk about something that's specific enough, you kind of have to choose. I guess we're running out of time. But
can I then suggest that we could have maybe if I had you as my co-supervisor, maybe we should call it tools and materials in such design processes.
Maybe.
In a practice.
I would have been more happy.
Okay. Maybe I would have so.
Alright, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to Laura. Now we move on to the third and final member of the committee, also the chair of the committee, Professor Ulstein.
Just three? Oh.
So first of all, thank you, Mika and Anna, for getting Nikolai warmed up. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that this is actually a day of celebration. Not just for Nikolai, but for all of us, because we are a research community, and every time there is some sort of knowledge production, in this case a PhD dissertation, it makes us reflect on what we are doing when we are doing research. And I would like to acknowledge the fact that your work, Nikolai, made me think about a lot of the stuff that I'm doing currently in my own research. So what I'll invite you to do, I assume that I'll invite everybody in the room to participate in, is sort of a collaborative investigation of what we can learn from Nikolai's work. But before I go into this sort of collaborative investigation, I would like to acknowledge a few facts about how I read Nikolai's dissertation. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the fact that Nikolai is pointing us in a new direction, or in a slightly new direction, focusing on materials in 3D that has not yet been fully covered in our research area. So that is a promising field of research and something that I myself will look more into in the future when bringing post-its, whether it's material, tools, technology or not, into my design processes. Also, I would like to acknowledge Nikolai's work on the PD, especially his PD lit review, is very interesting and very thorough, and I think that that's something that would be quite interesting to look more into in the future for the PD community as a whole. And finally, I think that having six well-published papers, each with a unique contribution to the GAI community, HCI community. The interaction design into PD is quite an achievement. Actually, I think it's an extraordinary achievement, and I would advise the PhD candidates in this room probably to aim a bit lower. This is not something we expect you to do. But again, it is an extraordinary achievement for Nikolai. Well, this said, there are also discussion points to look into when we're reading the dissertations. Anna was talking to you about materials and materiality, and I assume that you guys have more to talk about. That was just my assumption. And Mikael also went into discussing the pragmatism, which I also found very interesting. It's something, a discussion point that could sort of be developed even further. I want to take the discussion in a slightly different direction to discuss your research method. And actually, I try to frame the whole discussion or our collaborative investigation on how and to what extent does the research conducted in your thesis support the research question that you actually proposed in the thesis. To approach this question, I think we should start by looking into your research method in your research method section on page 11, because here you claim to be inspired by research through design. Now, I just recently learned, just have to mention this, that materials give direction and shape and inquiry. I learned that from a very famous researcher, Carlos Nikolai. So I made some materials or some tools to think with, which is on the board. So just before we go into this, I just want to introduce you to these sketches. So here you have what we're going to talk about. This is design materials, right? This is some of the questions I will ask you in a minute. So perhaps you can use some of them to think with, or perhaps it can give you some kind of direction in our conversation. But first I want to ask you, sort of reading your method section, what are the benefits of conducting design research through design? Could you elaborate on that?
I think honestly I've done it as well in a more coherent way than I can do it after two grueling quizzes here, but I'll try. So, can you hear me? Okay, sure. So, the advantage of doing design research through design is that you gain access to phenomena that you wouldn't gain access to anyway. That's sort of the super simple way of saying it. That you gain access to phenomena. And that's the case with any research method, I hope, that you choose it because you gain access to some phenomena that you wouldn't gain access to in any other way, or at least you gain access to them in a better way. So I can mention as sort of an anecdote that we once had an ethnographer look at some of our sort of set in on design processes, and I don't think much came of it, and there might be many reasons for that, but I would think that it's very confusing to sit in on a design process.
Hang on a second, let me just rephrase my question. What do you consider as the benefits in research through design that made the deliberate choice in your thesis that you want to bring in research through design?
Sure. Because my research specifically focuses on materials and tools, maybe, that give direction to and shape inquiry, as you said, well, then in order to try that out, in order to experiment with that, well, I have to bring in materials, work with new sorts of materials that can give direction and shape to an inquiry. That's sort of the very simple answer. And of course, we always do that in whenever we do design practices, right? We set up a workshop and we have some aim of setting up the workshop in a specific way. Sometimes, other times you see people just pulling a recipe off the internet, but let's ignore those people for a moment.
Yeah, I think that sometimes when I read papers on research through design, the argument is made that research through design provides you an opportunity to sort of stage different activities in which you can sort of drag out some of the issues that you're looking for.
Yes.
Was that the case in your research?
In
Did
some
you deliberately stage this as a way to study things?
Yes and no. I said that many times today. So, maybe that's what you're getting at, but in most of the cases, as you pull out the list of papers here, so for instance, doesn't matter. For instance, in the first case, the productive role of material design, etc., we had two aims. So I had sort of an underlying research interest in material design, but we also had a research we also have a design objective. And actually, other people in that process, my co-authors, my collaborators were not co-authors, that had other research objectives. So sometimes I will say that when you read the research through design literature, it just sounds like it's a laboratory experiment in the wild. We set up this experiment in order to test these hypotheses, and this is the data that came out. I will now analyze it. Now, in our case, the truth is more murky. Design research is also a wicked problem. How do I balance my own research interest with the aims of doing design research, with the aims of other researchers? And sometimes when you read research papers, I don't know if you agree, but I feel that sometimes when I read research papers, it is a little unclear exactly what these aims were. There's of course a contribution statement, so that's probably the aim, but is that really the case that you did this big project only to investigate this very minor question? And in that case, why did you design the experiment like that?
Yeah. I'll buy that definition, despite the fact that I think you should work a bit more on it so that you can sort of say that this is the reason why I did it and I deliberately did choose this and not this.
Okay.
Or perhaps I can help you a bit further in this sort of understanding.
Please do.
So what are the obligations that we need to consider when we're doing research through design? You have some, maybe you can talk about game rules.
Yes.
What are the game rules in research through design?
Well, I sort of mentioned one here, but I think I'll start with that one. Because in all humanistic research, I think, that's a bit broad, but at least in all studies of social phenomena that can be replicated in laboratories and so forth, there must be, by necessity, I think, there must be a game rule of transparency. It needs to be very transparent for you why I did what I did. And sometimes I would say, and I think, I'm not sure how clear Mein King was allowed to be in a journal paper on PD, but sometimes it's not only is it not clear why people did what they did, in some cases it's not even that clear what they actually did. So transparency must be the first game rule by necessity, I think.
Anything else you want to mention at this stage?
Yes.
Well,
okay,
I can just drop to the point.
Okay.
So we're making up some game rules and then we investigate how we sort of follow them. So we have to be very careful about what you say.
yes, that's fine.
So do you have anything else you want to sort of put into the game rules?
Maybe an obligation to design with librarians could be. That was a joke. No, that's not a word. So, okay, that's one game rule, being very transparent about the objectives of doing this.
Let's stick to that, Nikolai, because we have other questions to sort of look into.
Okay.
Now, also in your paper, when you talk about research through design, you're referring to Big and Brandt's work, and I think Big and Redstone's work. They were sort of articulated that the relationship between experimental design work and research question is something like a question, a program, and experiment.
Yes.
So perhaps just for the sake of the audience who have obviously not read your thesis, perhaps you could just very briefly sort of try to explain how you have worked with question, which is obviously how we make conceptualize the role, as you said earlier today, and the programs. I assume you have more than one program, and probably also mention some of the experiments, so that we as an audience can sort of get an introduction to how you have sort of conceptualized your research and your dissertation.
Yeah, sure, definitely. So the research question, as Mikael also managed to tease out for me, was not exactly that at the beginning, but it was sort of comparative. So that's the first thing, and everybody who's read that text probably knows that these different question, program, and experiment, they affect each other. So a program might lead you to change the research question. I would probably argue that a research question that doesn't change at all over the entire course of a PhD is that would make me suspicious. Anyway, so that's the first thing we have to say. So we can start from one end, saying the first. So my question has been developed through a series of programs, but what's also the case here is that these programs, when you read the text, they sound like it's just me doing your project. I hinted at that way before.
We know that, but now we're talking about your dissertation as something that you have deliberately planned for, and what I want to know is how did you do this? We all know that you are engaged in many interesting projects with a lot of stakeholders. Let's put that aside for now. Just talk about your dissertational work.
Okay. Yes. Sure. So one thing that's not evident in my dissertational work is how I came into these programs, because clearly I participated in programs here, for instance. Well, some of them is, for instance, the Participatory Information Technology Center. I suppose it has a program of some sort. It had a couple of programs. I'm part of the Participatory Innovation Program. I think that's probably where I would place myself. My PhD isn't so rigidly organized that you can say it like that. I think, but that's one program.
But let's be a bit more specific here, because I think that this is sort of where some of my questions really sort of arise from. I think you're talking about tabletop interaction, that's something that you should pursue. You're talking about the blueprint workshop, which is obviously some sort of a PD program that you're sort of trying to pursue. You're talking about, or you are actually have done publications on PD as literature studies, so obviously you have also sort of to try to pursue a more theoretical program.
Yes.
And then you have also done work on actor network theory, sort of trying to describe PE from that perspective. So perhaps you could sort of slightly try to. Okay. I want to know your understanding of the program and what kind of experiments you make.
Okay. I think I get it. So a program by necessity is, as I understand it, it is a way of working. It's a way of understanding the world that is then embedded in some experiments you do. So the example you mentioned with the actor network theory that Anna so kindly mentioned before, I mean, I will not stand here and claim that the actor network theory was my doing in that paper. And clearly, if you look at the author list, then
but it's a part of your dissertation.
It is part of my dissertation. So, but that one was actually part of the actor network theory paper. It's a terrible word for theory. It's impossible to say. Was actually part of a wider program of investigating participation. So that, which came together then with another program that actually some other researchers had. So I don't care about actor network theory. Well, I don't care about as a specific theoretical approach. I mean, it's useful for this case, but it's not an explicit program that I've been investigating.
But this is now we're sort of getting into something that's very interesting here, because I guess that you, as a PhD scholar, chose your own interventions. And one of the interventions you made, co-authored or not, with other people, was to make this study of how participation reflects in participatory design using actor network theory. So perhaps you can explain to the audience and to me, why did you choose this intervention and not, for instance, a detailed study of materials in PE processes?
Two things. I actually have a detailed study of materials in participatory. We can talk about that afterwards.
Or the blueprint workshop, right?
No, I have another one.
Okay,
that is more PE. Yeah, not published, but I didn't include it because it was not very good. It was not finished. That's what academic papers are, and they're not very good, they're not finished. So the way I would see it, and that's why I was I don't know if I'm objecting to that model, but I want to at least nuance it a bit. I would say that what happens in any research project is that a bunch of programs overlap and come together. So the STS people who now left have a research program on how might we use actor network theory for understanding social phenomena. Me and our bunch here, bonding in team here, we have an interest in understanding what is participation, and the research question in that one I care deeply about. How might we consider?
True, I acknowledge that that's a contribution, but the things that I sort of have a bit hard time of sort of accepting is that how does this end up in a contribution on materials in participatory design process?
Okay, well, that's the participatory design part, of course, of that question. So I didn't have time to unfold it probably in the presentation, but I would say that one, maybe it doesn't fit as well as it could have. I will acknowledge that. And that other paper that I wanted to talk to you about before was actually about how we explicitly might use materials to stage participatory design practices. Because I have been interested in participatory design and material for a very long time, and maybe I will happily agree, and maybe the title is for that reason poorly chosen, I don't know, but it wasn't quite brought together in the paper published. So what I would perhaps, if we had the time, I could perhaps say a few words about how we might use materials
I don't think we have time for that.
Okay, that's fine.
Later on.
We can
The
do this.
reception, at the reception, we can talk about that. How you can give another talk.
Yes, I'm trying to.
Nima, but I think that let's stick to this sort of understanding of how to do your research or how you've done your research, because can you sort of briefly mention the dynamic relationship between your question, the program and experiments, when it comes to where you work closest with the PD, that's the literature study and the ANT study.
Yes.
So Bind and Van, they're talking about this dynamic relationship with the program experiments, how they dynamically informs your research question. So I'm just wondering, just out of curiosity, how does a lit review on PD sort of dynamically reflect your question on materials in PD?
So, okay, yes. So, as you notice, a lot of the papers are not about PD. And a lot of the papers are a couple of the papers are about PD, and some of the first one actually tries to bring it together. There's some discussion of PD, of librarians as a keystone species, for instance, highlighting the importance of drawing them into the design process because they have a specific influence on the environment at the cloud. So the interest has always been there, I would say. And the way it has informed it is that a lot of the research programs that have been part of broader research programs that just my own have focused explicitly on participatory design. I mean, my PhD stipend was first funded by PIT, and then it was taken over by the Swedish project. It's a bit of a murky story with Nobel grants and all of those things, but it started out by being funded by PIT. So the interest came both from my background, the environment that I come from, and from a research interest that says that, well, all of the projects that I've been involved in, as I can't remember, sorry if it was Anna or Mika said that too, but all of the research projects that I've been investigating have been multi.
So basically what you're doing now is you're blaming the community basically this.
I'm not blaming them, but I'm actually blaming people who would claim that they started out all alone and then they chose all the things through this, and of course it's sort of a compelling narrative. Sorry, Anna, it's a compelling narrative, but this is not meant as an excuse. But I would say that it would be wrong to say that you alone.
Yeah, I agree on that. I totally agree on that. But isn't the fact that Bind and Brandt are pointing to the dynamic relationship between the question program and experiment?
Sorry, that's the term.
Isn't it sort of the fact that that's the reason why you start at some point and then you gradually turn your questions by having all these interventions in the world into something that you explicitly can address?
Yes.
Okay, so going back, why did you choose to bring in papers on participatory design, survey studies, and the understanding of PD in a dissertation on materials? From what perspective did you see that these kind of interventions was a good way to sort of get a grip on your understanding of materials?
It was because the project had an ambition of bringing those two things together. But
we're talking about your dissertation.
Yes.
So you could have sort of said, well, okay, let's do this as part of the project, but my research design needs me to go in this direction to tease out all my understanding of the materials.
Yes, I mean, one solution I could have chosen was to leave out the PD papers. I left out another one that's not in the dissertation on ownership in design processes. So what you could accuse me of here, if you wanted to, was to say, well, maybe you spread yourself a bit too thin during the PhD work. I will concede that that's another impossible.
Yeah, but again, I want to learn from you because you have studied this for 3 years. I just want to know what is sort of the idea, the grounding idea of bringing this in this survey, and that's why I'm sort of trying to dig into this. Now, you said that these two contributions is actually a contribution to PD. I'm not quite convinced. Do you see your two PD papers as a contribution to participatory design or to participatory design researchers?
Yes, it's definitely for participatory design researchers.
Okay, but I think again, allow me again to pose a very irritating question. You call this materials and participatory design processes, which sort of make me think about something that is of a value for a participatory designer. Whereas I do not see quite any sort of contributions to PD design but more to PD research?
I'm not sure I agree on that. So if we go to the lit review, for instance, let's start with that. What we do point out is some parts of the PD, at least, let me see now. So we do, in the lit review, we do point out some areas that people work with, and then some areas that people should be addressing now because they sort of fall into the side over time. People, for instance, the political aspect of participatory design has not been, it's not discussed as explicitly anymore as it was. We recently had a paper at the PDC conference here, which was, of course, too late to make it into the dissertation. But in that one, the political aspect is way more clear. So what it does actually in the paper is point to things that seem to be lacking. But that is encourage PD research, of course. So
and how about materials in PD? Could you have, in a lit survey, deliberately focusing on materials? Sort of either it was there or not, but I think it would even be a very great contribution to say, well, I have looked through 20 years of PD literature and it's not there.
That could have been a good idea. I think it's there, but that would have been a good idea. Yeah. And it was actually, so actually one thing about that was that the ambition, when we did delivery, first we actually tried to look at what people were actually doing in their projects, without sort of, for instance, we counted which methods they were using, looked at how do they describe what they were doing in their methods. But of course, it quickly turned out that if people's not writing about the design process, then they don't write a lot about their methods, right? So it would be very unfair to say, well, people don't write anything about the design process. Well, we might wish for that some people maybe we can then say, well, this is an area of research that there's not a lot of this research, so maybe it could be a good idea to go and do something. But I can't sort of blame people for not doing it if their paper is about something else, right? I mean, sure, they only have 10 pages.
But again, I think that what I'm trying to sort of understand here is the reasons why you did the research in a certain way, but also why you deliberately choose not to sort of have this argument made explicit in your thesis. That's what I'm looking into. But time is running, and we need to go further. Okay, I need to understand more about your work. Now, as far as I remember, Binder and Brandt in 2007 mentioned the need for what they call a traceable genealogy when we conduct experimental design with research. Are you familiar with that sort of term?
Yes, so we can elaborate on why something. Yes.
So genealogy basically means that they sort of extend the research question on what and for whom knowledge production is directed to also sort of include which context of debate the research is participating in, right?
Yes.
So one of the things that were annoying Anna and Mikael and me when reading your thesis is that you interchangeably use the terms interaction design, HDI, participatory design, research through design. I don't know, I think also sneaked in design studies, maybe you're not using it. I'm just trying to underline my point here. So perhaps you could sort of elaborate a bit about this. I'll just put it here because I think that this is not just a matter of words or bad wording in your dissertation. This is a matter of trying to establish an understanding of what you're talking about in different areas of your dissertation. So could you account for the genealogy of your survey study, for instance? Where does it arrive from? What is the sort of the debate that you tap into by bringing this in? And could you perhaps also see how this debate has been important, going back to the research question on materials, sort of to get the audience an understanding of why you did this, based on your understanding of genealogy?
Yes, okay. So the study is actually a lot older. The beginning of the study is a bit older than my PhD, so it would be wrong to say that I arrived at the PhD school in 2013 and then I started this study. It had begun before that, but of course the major writing work didn't take place until we got into it. So I would say that it actually started without much reference because I was a research assistant. There's no need for hiding anything here. I was a research assistant, so perhaps my program and interests were not the ones that was most in focus. So this was a study that was started perhaps without explicit reference to my future PhD work. That's the case in this case. So that's where it started, and I think that's quite important because you could say there's two approaches. Then I could sort of cut my losses and run the moment I got the PhD study and not care about PD anymore, just do materials and interaction design research process. Or I could try to turn this knowledge that I've already gained. This is where we get to the question and to the interplay between the program and the question, because here I actually have a program before I have my research question, right? So the question, could I turn this to an advantage?
So the whole sort of things that I'm asking about is, why do you include this? How can I see this as part of your PhD? So that you sort of reach beyond what I would call a patchwork PhD, which is basically putting all this mumbo jumbo and then say, oh, this is a dissertation, this is my identity, this is what I can offer the world.
Okay. Yes.
So that's what I need you to sort of convince me about.
So the first thing, of course, is that participatory design is also about design processes. I mean, that's the first thing you can start to say. So, like there could be something gained by study, we can explicitly suggest that industrial design processes. There's of course also something to be gained by studying participatory design processes. They have a special, they have a special coloring. Sorry, my English is failing. Yeah, flavor. Sorry, that's word is. They have a special flavor, but of course those gains have perhaps not been manifested explicitly in papers. And when I wrote the dissertation, I had the choice. Basically, it's quite short for an overview article. It's still 15 pages longer than the maximum at some American universities, but it's quite short still. It's 55, 52 pages, something like that. So I had the choice between doing what I've seen some PhDs do, which is real sort of theoretical, something on top of what they've already done, and try to explain how this patchwork came together. And I will be rude enough to say,
reading your dissertation, Nikolai, you sort of tap into multiple aspects of the design. You talk about participatory design and HCI and interaction design. And despite the fact that I do know that it sort of all fits under the umbrella of design, it is from a scholar and a very clever person as you, very interesting to see when you're talking about PD, when you're talking about interaction design, when you're tapping into these different field areas of debate, and why was it necessary for you to sort of be all over the place?
So I was, for a second, before I thought a little bit, I was tempted to say that I would say that I don't do HCI at all, but then I noticed I have a paper about interaction with a tangible tabletop, and so that could have landed in hot waters. So clearly I do a bit of everything.
And my question is why?
So that's a good question. Why? I mean, I would say that the research community I'm part of, which is also you, also do a little bit of everything. So it's never occurred to me. I'll be honest and say that it's never occurred to me that I, as opposed to the rest of you, should say, well, I don't want to go to Mordecai because I do interaction design.
No, but that's not really the case here. The case is that you are sort of trying to defend your dissertation from at least three different standpoints. So if I was to sort of bring in my high church PD hat, I would say this has nothing to do with PD.
Yes.
This is something to do with interaction design.
Okay.
Despite the fact that you claim and you put in two papers on participatory design. Now, getting back to what we can learn from your work is that why has it been the reason for you to bring in these different fields? And probably you could also consider the pros and cons for going so broadly to your dissertational work.
I think everybody who's been here for the last 3 hours probably have some ideas of the cons. I mean, it does come across. So, I didn't mean it that way. I just meant that, of course, if you do something which has a very wide range of, not a very wide range, but a somewhat wide range of potential audiences, AGI, participatory design, interaction design processes, yourself, then of course you run the risk of someone saying, the border police, the border control, the high church PD hat, the high church HCI people turning up and saying this is not HCI or this is not interaction design or something like that. That's a danger, I think. And I don't think necessarily, I mean, I'm very tempted by border policing, for instance, participatory design once in a while myself, but I'll resist it for now. So I think that that's the disadvantage. I run the risk of diluting my own message.
But I think this is not just about policing. This is much more to sort of understand how your message comes across. This is what you're communicating with what kind of debate are you actually trying to engage with, engage in here?
Yeah.
But I think that's the whole idea, the whole notion. So I'll provide you one more sort of example for you to sort of consider. Because when I was reading a thesis, I sort of got into sort of the whole sort of pragmatism experience again, reading Schoen and Peter's work and others' work. I think that this is very valuable. But then again, I read your paper, and you had just learned me that pragmatism is basically the shit when it comes to doing design, right? And then I read about A&T, and I was like, what's happened here? So could you sort of tell me why this was necessary for you to bring in when you have in your dissertation worked with pragmatism, and then you all of a sudden turn into A&T to discover an important part of the dissertation that actually went into 1 out of 6 published papers that you present for us?
So for me, going to the paper was, let's call it a genealogy here. So there's the lit review, which is quite purely an examination of PD. There we go.
Yeah.
Yes. And that actually, the A&T paper, the participation as a matter of concern paper, it was heavily on the lit review. So you could say that the first experiment generated a new experiment.
Okay.
So, and yes. So
And I think that's, now we're sort of getting to the very center of this. So if that was your experiment, first you did the survey, then you did an analysis of participation in participatory design.
Yeah.
And you deliberately chose actor network theory to sort of illuminate this.
Yes.
What does that bring to your overall research question, where you examine pragmatism as your theoretical background?
Yeah. So I would say that, in my opinion, research is also an experimental practice in that I didn't know whether actor network theory could bring something to the table, but I had a strong sense that I had no good idea of conceptualizing how I would conceptualize what participation is and isn't using in pragmatist terms. So,
but you obviously did a very good contribution using A&T, but don't you, as a research field designer, has an obligation to go back to a research question to look into it and say, perhaps pragmatism is not the only answer, because I myself do not use pragmatism to analyze this, I use actor network theory.
Yeah, you're probably right. I will give a very honest answer as well, because any program has an end, and this was a paper published by it, so I feel that it would have been too late to engage with A&T in a more well, maybe we could have engaged with A&T more directly, but not on a. I wouldn't have time to do more experiments to stay within your frame here.
But what Anna and Mikael and I was doing when reading the thesis is to see whether this is coherent argument.
Yeah.
You state that pragmatism is basically the way to approach materials in participatory science.
Yes.
Except from understanding participation, which we use actor network theory to do. So do you see this as a coherent argument? Do you see it as an exception? And why did you address it in your thesis summary?
I would concede that I should have addressed it in the thesis summary. I'll start there. Then I will say that we wanted to address participation in a pragmatist, participation and materials in a pragmatist perspective. But the paper got rejected, and that's why we didn't include it. So my option, if that paper had been accepted, I could have had the option of actually pulling the actor network theory paper out. Okay, now nobody has really wanted to ask me about the material interaction of containable tabletops. You have mentioned sort of that that's about tabletops and so on. But someone could say, well, look, that's not about design process. And I mean, that's not a secret. There's no cross in the design processes marking there. But by necessity, I think that doing a PhD like this is sort of a balancing act, right? Because, of course, if I had done a 3-year PhD and I'd written a monograph, then I could sort of use the dart trick and say, you know, I knew what I was doing all along, and I did some experiments. It's been a fantastic journey, etc., etc., etc. And I could sort of maybe not be, you can say this is a very, very honest account of a PhD, right? Well,
Yeah.
you almost tell, and maybe too honest.
Or probably not too honest, because I think that you sort of, you said yourself that one of the guiding principles of reception design is transparency.
Yes.
For me, it was not transparent why you brought this in.
No.
But Peter says that we're not allowed to celebrate your thesis anymore, so we have to stop. So just before we stop, I just want to see whether you have an answer to the question that I sort of introduced in the beginning. How and to what extent do you think that your research and paper supports your research question?
Yes.
I promise that this is my last question.
Okay. It's hard to give a short answer to.
Yeah, I'm fine on.
Okay, sure. So, as I've been discussing with Anna and Mikael, it provides a theoretical way of conceptualizing the role of materials play in interaction design processes. Maybe we could, and then I will concede or wish for another year of a PhD in order to bring together maybe two of the columns here, the participatory design column and the design processes column. And that comes with, of course, a bit of regret, but also an explanation in that was actually the aim. But I wish that had been clearer from here, but I was unsure of how much. There's no future work session in my dissertation, because it always seems to me that future work is an excuse to just say, oh, and if I had $1 million, I would buy a unicorn and also solve a theoretical problem, but I didn't have time. So I felt like that, being brutally honest, that I wouldn't make promises that I didn't have any backing for making. So that was the reason for that.
Okay, thank you so much, Nikolai. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you to Professor Ulsai Iversen, and thanks to the committee in general for your work, and to Nikolai for inspiring and occasionally heated discussions. The committee will now withdraw to evaluate the outcome of this session and decide whether they will recommend the Graduate School of Arts to award the PhD degree to Nikolai. Meanwhile, the department will host a reception for the rest of us in the lunchroom, which is room 229 in the Nyborg building at Helsingforsgade 14. This reception will commence in half an hour. Do not worry if the committee is not there at 1:15. The committee needs lunch and time for discussions of today's events. That brings an end to the first part of the formalities today. And then during the reception, the committee will announce their decision. Thank you for now.
Yeah. This, just to be very clear, is a reception. It's open to absolutely everybody. Everybody who's here, or if you have a friend who couldn't make it at all, welcome to come. So, just so nobody thinks it's only for. Thank you.